Road. Center.
This is not actually part of the tour, but it is
now I
part of the
think
tour
it's working.
today.
Now I think it's working. Okay. Sorry, yeah, we're just we just got this technology. So hello everyone, my name is Jason Plourde. One of the things that you're gonna see today is that public art is never easy. That it's a challenge, especially when you're doing something thematic in something that touches people as deeply as the AIDS pandemic has, and when you just can't foresee, what's going to be when the next pandemic might pop up in the midst of doing a memorial about a pandemic. So there, what we thought was going to be done in the summer of 2020 is now just being completed, and you'll see later on that that some of the artworks are still ready to be unwrapped, but you'll still be able to get to see everything nonetheless. So Rosette will talk more about that later. AIDS, of course, had a huge impact on our communities, and many felt it was important to remember that history and the history of the pandemic, how people survived, and how people supported each other. So a group of people came together and really pushed forward on this idea of making a memorial, and it's happened, which is great. The AMP recognizes that history, but also recognizes the ongoing issues with HIV and AIDS. Its continuing nature makes it unique. Usually when we think about a memorial, we think about it as something that's happened and finished in the past, and of course we're using a memorial, there wasn't a discrete period of time that arguably the worst of the pandemic was in the first 2 decades, but AIDS is still with us, and so we need to remember that. A lot of the artwork speak to that ongoing nature. The Seattle area, for those who may not be as familiar, was considered a second wave region. We had news of what was happening around larger metropolitan centers like New York City, Los Angeles, and San Francisco before it hit here. And many people around the city used that opportunity to prepare as best they could. There was support on many levels. The first case of AIDS in Seattle was in late 1982, and by 1983, the Seattle City Council set aside funds for AIDS treatment and research, and it was only the second city in the U.S. to do that. So people in the city acted fast and acted collaboratively, and that was quite unique. Community leaders and organizations set up what was called the continuum of care, which helped support people through all stages, from diagnosis to treatment, caregiving, and end-of-life care. A lot of people came together to help. Actually, many of the AIDS service organizations are based within blocks of this location. The Northwest AIDS Foundation was on this block, and then it eventually was across the street, kind of where Dick's, in the building next to where Dick's is. Chicken Soup Brigade was based around here, and of course, outreach happened at many of the bars and social spaces within this neighborhood. Since many LGBTQ people were living here, Capitol Hill was an epicenter of the epidemic and provided a core of support. So folks from around the region came to Seattle and came to this neighborhood actually for help. So it's meaningful and was actually serendipitous that the AMP was able to be created here. Like, we weren't exactly sure where the site would be for the AIDS Memorial Pathway when we started this project, and through a series of events, the architects of this development connected with folks in the group and really encouraged us to do that, so that they could have artwork on this site that was meaningful and had a connection to this community. Having the park department next door that was also equally supportive and wanted to have some sort of connection to AIDS and HIV was really a great thing as well. So there were attempts to establish an AIDS memorial in the 1990s. It was intended to be a little south of here at Madison and Union. But the idea never made it to fruition. It proved too difficult, too painful at the time. And there's a video, actually, with former City Council member Sherry Harris on the AMP website about that. Rosette here did an interview that he can talk about later on. But there is documentation of that history, and that kind of spoke to the fact that while you're in the midst of the worst of that pandemic, it is really difficult to create something to memorialize it. And so we needed some time. In 2015, another city council member, Tom Rasmussen, started a community group. Went with this idea. By that time, enough distance was had. AIDS looked very differently as it does today, and there was significant interest in there creating this momentum so that the AIDS Memorial happened within a few years of that. So 2015, 7 years now. So it took us 7 years altogether to make this happen. Okay, so let's take a look at the first artwork. If you want to stand up, I mean you can see it from there, but I'm going to step over here. So the title of this piece is "And I'm Gonna Miss Everybody." Yep. "And I'm Gonna Miss Everybody." It's by Christopher Paul Jordan. And in Christopher's words, the piece is a portal into the spaces of radical gathering, hospitality, celebration, and care that Black, brown, poor, trans, queer, and otherwise excluded communities have forged to take care of our own. You'll notice it's made of speaker forms, some actually from queer spaces and clubs, others are replicas, and the color palette along the sides contains shades of muted rainbow colors, also tones reminiscent of faded posters. The back of the piece is brushed, polished, stainless steel, so it's a completely reflective surface. It's composed of 3-foot deep blocks that create this X shape. So I'm going to ask some questions, and I'll give you some information as we're going through. See, this is where getting my teaching degree. I'm not just going to give a tour. I'm going to pull you into this and engage you in that way. So why do you think the artist would create this shape to look like an X? And what does that mean to you? Anyone care to share? Stop. X means stop, exactly. Barring something. And a lot of people, it was, a message that was heard repeatedly through the AIDS epidemic. Don't do this, you're doing something wrong, and can represent a barrier to access for care and support. There also, there's an unknown. X is kind of an unknown, and there's this concept of HIV-X, that whether you're individually negative or positive, once one person in our community is HIV positive, we all need to deal with that. We all need to be concerned about the care of that individual and how we can move forward. So HIV-X means it's unknown what your status is, but we're still all affected by that. A more direct application is that he did take the HIV plus sign and tilted it on its axis. Some other symbols from that shape are referred to in the text here. There's the Dikenga, Dikenga, which is a symbol used by the African diaspora of these two lines intersecting. Often it represents the intersection between life and the afterlife. So this portal between two worlds. And that was another thing that the artist wanted to reference with this piece. So I always think that X can also mean strength. Like if you make yourself as big as possible, you extend your limbs, and you're saying either stop or you're saying, I'm here, I'm stronger than all this. And I love that. But I know that many people will have their own interpretations of that. So it's a unique aspect of this artwork. And then reasons that this sculpture includes speakers calls us into connection. It's reminiscent of the gathering spaces that he refers to in his opening description of this. Like, this is where people learned about the epidemic. In those clubs, in the bars, you would hear about your friends. You would talk about what was happening in the community. There wasn't an internet back then, right? I think everyone here maybe, as old as I was, so we know in the 80s and 90s, there wasn't the rapid sort of communication and news sources that we have today, for better or for worse. But that information wasn't easily accessible in a lot of places. because it included taboo subjects that the mainstream media was not willing to talk about. So you had to go to the clubs, the bars, and really share that information. And so these speakers are talking about that. And it's also this representation of sound and speaking out, but they're silent. There is this ability for something to shout it out, but it's held back in this sculpture in some ways. So those are, again, multiple interpretations, but the artist really wanted to connect to that. Another aspect, you'll see there's multiple parts of the amp, and they each have their own character. And so we knew this plaza would be active and loud, as we've experienced with traffic and people going by. And so this artwork really needs to work in conjunction with that. It wasn't a place for this morose, somber. I think that's what most people think about when you think about a memorial. We have this within our society, or mainstream society, this idea of memorials having to be very sad and somber. And this was a piece that really wanted to work with the activity of this space, and to be active, and to consider that, not only was there sadness, but there was also celebration, celebrating the positive things people did, the support, the care, the tremendously courageous things that people did. So celebrating that, and celebrating what the people that we lost brought to our lives. So many creative and remarkable people have been lost to the AIDS epidemic, and so it's celebrating what they brought to our world while they were here, as well as mourning their loss. So obviously I hope that you'll come and explore more of this artwork, but we're going to continue on. We're going to go to the next piece, and you'll see that there's 3 groupings of artworks. There's one right here on the northeast part of the plaza, there's one in the southwest, and there's one right across the street in the park. So what I'm going to ask us to do is, as we walk over there, take a look at the signs, these protest signs. The piece is called "We're Already Here," and look at the messages. And I want you to remember one message that really resonates with you, and we're going to kind of talk about those at our 3rd grouping over there, okay? So we're all going to individually walk. You can walk this way, you can walk that way, you can go by both, but we're going to cross the street and congregate again at that 3rd grouping, okay?
And also there are messages on both sides.
Yes, messages on both sides.
All right.
So take a look at both sides. Think about one that resonates with you. Another individual that I want to make sure we draw attention to, this park is named for Cal Anderson. We're standing in Cal Anderson Park. Cal Anderson was was Washington State's first openly gay state senator. Cal worked for social justice and on the behalf of many disenfranchised groups. He was an example of someone working within the system to stop HIV and provide support to those impacted by AIDS. And he sadly died of AIDS in 1995. So there's a little bit about him on the plaque here. There's a plaque bearing his name at the entry of the park on this corner. But it was another sort of really meaningful connection, that having this
memorial on this park bearing his name. It was a strong and meaningful connection. Okay, so a couple of questions for you. What are things that stood out with you? What are some of the messages that you found particularly meaningful or interesting on the signs that you looked at? You were not alone. Yeah. It's a really important thing that needed to get out there that people were not feeling at the time. Fighting for our lives. Yep.
Spreads a lot further than just this particular issue.
Yep. Yeah, that relates to a lot of issues, and that's sort of a common phrase that people throw around, fighting for our lives, but it really has an urgency and meaning when you deal with when people who were dying in droves and people weren't caring, and so people had to step up and fight for their individual lives and the lives of others. There was a lot of great messages here, and of course, it's important to have these on these signs because people weren't saying them. People weren't, and I mentioned before, mainstream media was not covering HIV and AIDS. They weren't talking about some of the issues. They were afraid to talk about gay sex. They were afraid to talk about IV drug users. They were afraid to talk about safe sex practices, like things that people still have, can be a little bit uncomfortable talking about today, that they needed to break through that stigma and that fear that people had. And so brandishing those words on signs was a way to do that. And then I talked about how HIV activism helped with COVID vaccinations. How many vaccines do we have for COVID right now? 3, 5, I think there's 6, 7 in other regions. How many do we have for HIV and AIDS? 0. So it talks about, it relates to the public will and the public, there's also complexities of virus, like they're not the same. HIV and coronavirus, they're different, but there are reasons why we see that there's been this, we have so many vaccines now to help us with this current pandemic, and the one just previous to that, HIV and AIDS, still doesn't have that. They're getting close, and a lot of the mRNA research that was developed for the COVID vaccines is actually going to help with HIV and AIDS, and we hope that there will be one soon. But yeah, still not. Okay, so we're going to continue down to the south end of the park, at the other end of the reflecting pool, and we're going to walk by the gatehouse. Some people also call it the pump house. It's that building right there at the other end of the reflecting pool. And you'll see that in each of the window niches, there's artwork there. And that's a temporary artwork piece done by Claire Johnson that was created for the Office of Arts and Culture, but that is related to HIV and AIDS. So we want to take a look at those while we can.
Gathering consultant. So that meant that I went out and talked to dozens of people, some 40, 50 people, asking them to share their stories about HIV and AIDS. So I'll talk about that a little bit, but one of the things that I'll say that sort of connects that all together is that one of the things I learned about HIV and AIDS is that it's about stories. Right? It's about the story that you have about it. It's about the story of the person who's standing next to you, their experience of HIV. It's about a city's story, right? It's about a country's, a culture, gender. Like there's so many different stories about AIDS. And that was one of the most important things I learned, was that there isn't a story, right? It's stories really about HIV and AIDS. And that's one of the great things about the AMP that I feel. It really works to convey all the different stories, so many different stories. And another thing I think that's really fantastic about us being here now is that really it's like we stepped into a time machine. And that's one of the great things about the AMP, is that really we are, it was driven by many people who experienced sort of the early hard battle days of what they call, the early hard pandemic days in the 80s into the 90s, to the mid 90s or so. And yet we can be talking about that, and we can be thinking about it today here. And there could be people who were alive then who didn't think they would be alive now who are still here, those long-term survivors that Jason was talking about. So all that is really here. And it's here with people playing soccer and people on skateboards and walking dogs and people who just kind of step by and kind of go, what's happening right here, right? So that's like the story of AIDS, is all the stories that are happening all the time and are constantly moving around us. So, saying that, so one of the other things is the AMP is here on Capitol Hill. It was a really important place for the history of HIV/AIDS in the region, but also things connected to this story happened or are located, situated in other places. So one place that I'd like to point out is a place called POCAN. Maybe you've heard of this place. POCAN stood for People of Color Against AIDS Network. It began in 1987, and it was a response to communities of color feeling as if they were being overlooked, and how people talked about AIDS, and also how they addressed healthcare, right? People, black people, brown people, Latinx people felt like stories didn't represent them, and healthcare professionals didn't necessarily think that these people were really being deeply impacted. But of course they were. I think a word that many of us know now is intersectionality, right? How things always intersect. So here were black and brown folks facing a disease that of course white people were also facing, right? But the healthcare disparities that black people experienced could magnify what happened. There were, people were testing all kinds of drugs, but black and brown people weren't considered in the testing. So, would it make a difference? And how was it spoken about to those communities? Jason was talking earlier about sort of how people didn't want to talk about it at the time. And even now, people still don't want to talk about HIV/AIDS in some places, right? But that stigma was so real. And that was one of the responses, that's one of the reasons that drove people to create POCAN. So POCAN still exists today. It's based on Rainier Avenue down in the Rainier Valley. You probably drive by it if you go down there and never know it's sitting right there on the side of the road that all this work is happening. So POCAN did a lot of work engaging with community members, and it also spearheaded a fantastic program of going to the Women's Correctional Center, or Washington Correctional Center for Women, sometimes known as Purdy Prison, right? And doing a program there about HIV education in the prison, in a women's prison, right? Which is like groundbreaking work in the late 80s, early 90s, right? So as we're here now, we're talking about HIV and the story of what happened then and sort of what's happening now. It's changed. Just like we're experiencing now in this pandemic with COVID-19, diseases, illnesses change over time. Who gets impacted, what the impacts look like, and where they shift to. So in relation to that work around intersectionality, POCAN has now expanded the work that it does. So it works on issues of incarceration, people who are unhoused, mental health issues, stigmas as well for healthcare. So it has really sort of cast its net really wide, sort of after doing the first bits of sort of fishing with that little net, of catching the little fish that they could. Now the net is thrown wide. All right, so that's POCAN down there in the Rainier Valley. The N is for network. Is that what you asked?
Yeah.
Great. All right. Also, Jason mentioned this organization as well, Bailey Boucher House. So Bailey Boucher House started in 1992, summer of 1992. Madison Valley, down there on Madison Avenue. You probably drive by it if you go down there in the Madison Valley, and you may not even know it's there. But at the time when construction was happening, woo! People did not want that there in the Madison Valley. Such opposition, right? It's the whole NIMBY thing, right? We see it all over the place, everywhere. It happens all the time, right? So here it was. AIDS phobia was rampant in the late 80s and 90s, and you can still say it exists now. But it was, so, I mean, you know, like Jesse Helms. Remember Jesse Helms, right? The things that people would say out loud about people with a terminal illness, right? It's beguiling to think now, but that's what happened. And that's what was happening when people were trying to construct Bailey Boucher House. So there was all this, we don't want that there. One person who was opposed happened to be sitting on the board of SAM, Seattle Art Museum. So Seattle Act Up decided, how can we get to that person on SAM and the board of SAM? There's supposed to be a fundraiser. They were building what was the Asian Museum, called the Asian Museum in Volunteer Park. And so there's supposed to be a fundraiser, and ACT UP Seattle decided they were going to protest at the fundraiser, right? To really make it known that people are trying to oppose this facility to help people who are dying. Well, the word got out that this protest was going to happen, and this board member, speaking to his wife, was like, she's like, I think maybe you might want to change your attitude about what's happening. And so he backed down from his opposition, and now here we have Bailey Boucher House. Hello, dear. Nice to see you. So, Bailey Boucher House down on Madison Avenue, and it was created by AIDS Housing of Washington with the help of Chris Hurley, who was the first executive director of the organization. And again, it was the only place at the time where people living with AIDS could go and die, to be cared for. Drag queens used to come and read stories to people, right? People could have last rites. There were indigenous people there who had ceremonies. People were working there to care for these individuals. Now, much like POCAN has spread wide its net to help other people, now Bailey Boucher House helps people dealing with terminal illnesses, and also helps unhoused people as well. They started their program recently. So you can see that from here, from the work that began with these ASOs, or AIDS service organizations, they have now sort of spread their wings to incorporate and help care for many kinds of people. All right, so those are just some of the places that are connected to this place here. All right, so now we're going to walk. We're going to go back up this pathway. We're going to go to the northeast end of the park, and we're going to see some artwork that's there. All right, so we'll take another little stroll. Connected. I'm connected to you all here today is what it's reminding me, which is true, really. It's one of the great things about being in a city together is how you get to be connected with each other. You walk past these people and sometimes you don't know who they are or what they've done, right? Or how they've contributed to the well-being of the place where we live. So, one thing I forgot to say about Bailey Boucher House is that Bailey Boucher House is named after two people. Thatcher Bailey, who was an AIDS activist, who I found out just recently from being here, lived near where the Bailey Boucher House is now. Like, he grew up near there, which I didn't know. So, and Thatcher had a partner, Frank Boucher, who died of AIDS in 1989. So, Bailey Boucher, Thatcher Bailey, Frank Boucher. That's where the name comes from. All right. So here we are at another one of our artworks, which is called Ribbon of Light. Now, Jason mentioned earlier about the thing about a public art project is you really never know how long it's going to take. Well, right now you're seeing exactly what that looks like in real time, right? We thought this artwork was going to be completed in June 2020, and now it's June 2022, and we see that it is complete, but we can't get near it to see its beautiful state of completion. How about that? So we still have this chain link fence, and you can see that the pieces are still wrapped here. But these artworks were created by an artist named Horatio Hung-Yun Law, who lives in Portland but grew up in New York and really has experience of HIV/AIDS from New York City, which was also one of those first wave cities, one that was really hit. A lot of creative people there died. So Horatio created these pieces of artwork. They're called Ribbon of Light. You see there's 3 different pieces. Each one has an individual name. This one is called Lambda. This is Reverie. And this one is Monolith, over there. So I encourage you to come back to the park when this should be removed. We're hearing it should be removed within the next week to 2 weeks. This should be removed. Should be able to get here close. You can walk along this pathway here. Again, that's the pathway. And it'll take you past this artwork. And these pieces are like fused panes of glass, right? Really beautiful seafoam color. So it's several sheets of glass like fused together. And there are words etched into the pieces of glass. So if you get close, you'll be able to see words. Horatio asked people words that they thought about when they thought about HIV and AIDS. And some of those words he embedded in the glass. Another magnificent aspect of this artwork is that it actually has lights embedded in it. So when the sun sets, these pieces will glow. Right. This is, there are many aspects to the story of HIV/AIDS. We hear a lot about resilience. The ex-speakers, right? That is about the unknown, but you can also think about sort of going to discos and clubs and just sort of experience this ecstasy with your community, right? That's there. Here we have some artwork there that's on the gatehouse, pump house that talks about stigma, right? Also incorporates the rainbow flag in there, in the artwork, right? Well, this is more of the sort of reflective place, right? The place where people can gather, recall loved ones and memories here, and this ribbon of light. So Horatio also has sort of an integral part to the AMP because Horatio is an artist and he created the master art plan, which sort of conceived how this whole space would look. So it's this 80-page document, right? He put together this 80-page master art plan, interviewed dozens of people, community members, people who worked at nonprofits, to ask them, like, what would you like to see in a memorial? And then he investigated other memorials in the country and tried to figure out where we could site things and what the opportunities were in the space, right? So there is, I don't know, if you've lived here in the past, like there used to be a lot of things there. None of this was there like several years ago, right? And so now there's the light rail station underneath of it. And so this space is sometimes referred to as a TOD, or transit-oriented development. So Horatio thought, wow, what if we had sort of like, if there was a plaza there, you could have like one big artwork there, sort of like a centerpiece artwork that's there. And then you could we really thought about how to connect these pieces. In truth, it's called the AMP now, but it actually wasn't its original name. The original name was the Seattle Arts the Seattle AIDS Legacy Memorial, I believe. Sort of SAL, which doesn't really roll off the tongue very well. I think it's it. And so they thought of the new name, and they thought of AMP, and they thought of the pathway, and then that really helped to guide the work as well in the Master Art Plan. Like, what does a pathway look like? People walk along the pathway. How do we connect ideas, people, and places together? So Horatio sort of conceived this idea of having artworks situated in various places that could connect together, that people could experience in a pathway and walk along and have a whole integrated, multifaceted experience. So another thing I'm going to show you, we're going to see as we walk over here, I'll point it out, and that will lead us to the last stop. But I'll ask if you have any questions before we continue on, or any thoughts you'd like to share yourself. Yes?
You may talk about this more later, but how did you find the people that you interviewed?
Sure, I can start talking about it now. So, I was hired to do this job, and the idea was the story gathering project has two phases. So the first phase was to focus on stories of Black and brown folks. So I got hired to do this, and the idea was to interview, I think it was like 155 people, and to get the stories of 155 people, and there were going to be these kiosks set up at like Pride events and at offices, and people could go to the kiosk and record a story for like 1 to 2 minutes, and then all these videos are going to be put together. And I went around and started talking to people about this idea, and the first thing I realized that people's stories were so potent that they needed more than 90 or 120 seconds to tell their story. So I was like, I think it'd be, what if instead I just sat down and just said, tell me about yourself, and just let people talk. And so I just listened to people talk for like hours. And so I went to organizations, nonprofits, places like Pocan and Bailey Boucher House, spoke to the executive directors and said, are there people you think I should speak to? And they would recommend names, and then I would speak to people, and those people would go like, you should talk to this person. Oh, you know what? My friend has a really great story about the 611 bar, right? And so they would just connect me to all these other people. So it was like the story started telling me what to do, right? So I just basically had to listen and go, okay, that's where I'm gonna go. And then the hard part about that is, I just have to tell the people, like the city leaders and everything, well, this was the original idea, but what about this idea? So, I had to work in real time to go with what people said. So that's how I found people. And I'll tell you a little bit more when we get to the next site. But any other questions before we move on?
How come the fence is still there? Dang it.
They were supposed to take the fence down, and they haven't done it yet. That's why. I wish it were better. I wish it weren't there, but there we go. Pandemic happened, so that caused all sorts of delays that way. Truth be told, one of the pieces was delivered and was being assembled, and they had a crane, and it was strapped to the crane, and then the piece slipped through the strap, and then it broke. So they had to recast it and make another one. So that added to another delay. So some of the pieces have been there a little longer than others. I think this one was just a couple months ago that one was recently set. But as you see, it's still wrapped in plastic, and they have to do a little bit more work with ADA compliance there. So they're trying to work these last bits out, but hopefully it'll be very soon. All right, so I'm stopping here because I wanted to point out this tree. Yes. Do you have a story about this tree?
No, not really.
All right. So this tree is this tree right there in the corner. Yes, it's referred to as a Chinese poplar tree, and it is believed to be, if not the oldest, one of the oldest trees around here. And when Horatio was designing the master art plan, he saw this tree and thought of it as sort of an anchor to the AIDS Memorial Pathway. And he really wanted it to somehow be prominent to this pathway, to this whole place, to this memorial. And so he really wanted to incorporate the tree into the space where people will be actually walking through the pathway. And so I'll just say that about the tree. So, and it's a lovely, fantastic tree. I mean, it's just really beautiful. Just sitting right there. Okay, so now we're going to go up this sidewalk, and we're going to go into a building, into a room on the corner of this building here. Okay? Right here, which is built by Community Roots Housing, has 110 affordable housing units. Stop on the tour. Here we are, we're in the Kathy Hillenbrand Community Room, which is named for a local neighborhood activist and Kathy Hillenbrand was on the board of Community Roots Housing. And here we are. In this way, we loved one another. This piece here was created by artist Stormy Weber, who is a biracial queer artist. And Stormy created this piece sort of as a historical remediation, restoring narratives of people who are often overlooked, working class folks, activists, healers, leaders, witnesses, and ancestors who were lost to the AIDS crisis. So this, to me, is one of the, well, they're all really fascinating pieces of artwork. Like, they're all so different, right? Like a giant X sculpture. There are the signs, protest signs, that are actual protest signs that people use in this region. And here, this is like the only artwork that has representational images of people, right? And you can see this when you're walking down the street, right here. So, and you see that there are black and brown folks in these images, right? That was really important to Stormy, to make sure to show black and brown people and to make sure that their stories were heard and they weren't overlooked. And so Stormy has quotes here from people. There are some stories that are mentioned and spelled out here on these little white placards with some of the people here. But one person I do want to point out is this person here with the pearl necklace. It's Alia Messiah, who works for POCAN. She was one of the first people who started working for POCAN in 1987, and she's still working there, right? What's that, like 35 years, right, of working for an organization helping people in the community. And when I mentioned that there was a program where someone went to the prison and helped women who were incarcerated living with HIV, that was her. That was her dealing with that program. So this here, oh, and I'm pretty sure that's Brian Day that we were talking about, Brian Day, and his quote about we're already here. So, some of the people that you've already been hearing about, some of the ideas and things that we've already touched upon are also represented right here, right? It's like one way of bringing it all together. So, someone asked earlier about how I found people to have stories. Like, how did I identify people? And it's the people helped me identify other people. So I mentioned there were two phases. The first phase was really focused on Black and brown folks. The second phase was still focusing on Black and brown people, but also trying to get stories from trans folks, speaking to medical researchers about what it was like. Journalists, what was it like covering HIV/AIDS in the early 80s and into the 90s? What was that experience like? So again, this was really about trying to hear what people suggested. You know, we had an organization called the Community Action Group, CAG, and there were volunteers, and so it was just like, who do you think I should speak to? And I went out and tried to find some of those people. One of those people I spoke to was Ali Messiah, right? She invited me to her home, and I sat down on her couch with her, and she just told these incredible stories. Spoke to former county council member Larry Gossett. Larry Gossett had a brother who was living with AIDS and died of AIDS. So Larry Gossett shared that story. I spoke to Jean Emerson, the newscaster, about the work that she had done covering HIV/AIDS. And so many people. I tried to speak to people who were living with the virus, parents of people who had died. I spoke to one woman whose father was a school teacher and had died of AIDS when she was young. I think maybe she was 10, 11, 12 when her father died, and sort of remembering that experience and sharing that story. So it was really one of the most incredible things I've ever done in my life. Really, people had said to me, oh, how are you going to do it? It's going to be so heavy. It's going to be so hard. But I can't deny that there weren't tears, because people were crying and people were still angry and confused and so many emotions. But the other thing about it was amazing to be with people who cared so deeply about someone that they wanted to talk about this person. They wanted to talk about their son or their coworker or their father and talk about them with love and reverence. Those things were really, really beautiful. So I interviewed all these people, and you can see some of these stories, some of these people if you'd like. So you can go to our website, theamp.org, and that will again describe to you the artwork that's here, the process that went into building this memorial, and it also has a page dedicated to stories. So I took some of these interviews that I did and turned them into videos. So I may have interviewed someone for 90 minutes and their story is encapsulated in a 7-minute video. So there are about 50 plus of these stories on the website that I helped to edit. I either edited or edited with other people. Like I said, it's a whole range of folks. And then there's also the opportunity for people to upload their own stories. We're all so familiar with these now, right? You can record your own story and you can upload it to YouTube, and you can send us a link and we'll upload the stories there. So you can see all kinds of stories, people talking about all manner of things related to how HIV/AIDS impacted their lives in Western Washington. And if you're really, really tech savvy, you can also go to the Google Play Store or the App Store on your iPhone, and you can download the AMP app. So we worked with a developer to create this app. It might take a little while to load there. It also gives you some of the experiences here. It has a few AR features, augmented reality features, And one thing which some people involved with creating the AMP wanted to do was to remember those people who died. So Seattle Gay News used to print the names of people who died. And so we got a copy of Seattle Gay News that had some 3,000 names, and used, by asking a number of volunteers, we recorded all of those names. So you can go to the app and you can hear those names that are being read out by all different kinds of people. And also that Chinese scholar tree that I showed you is turned into an augmented reality presentation where like ribbons are coming out of the tree to represent each one of those names as well. So again, we tried to incorporate as many aspects of the stories around HIV/AIDS as we could into the AMP.
And what's that?
The AMP, THE. You want the app or the website? The app should just be called the AMP Viewer.
No, it's an app.
It's an app, yes.
Yeah.
And so here we are at the end of our tour. So I'm going to again ask if there are any questions that you might have.
This place here, this room,
Sure. Thank you for your pause. Yes. So,
how is it used?
great question. So this is a community room. It's connected to the Station House building.
Okay, right.
Right. So it is locked, but the place can be used for community events. So people have access to the room. And so I think that's one of the things which the AMP is hoping to do, is try to find ways to invite more people into the space. And I should also say that the AMP was a public-private process, and now it's being managed by Gay City. So, you know, we had a number of pieces to deliver, the artwork, the stories that I did. I have all these pieces completed. And when it was all completed, we were trying to figure out how will they be managed? How will they be cared for in the future? So now Gay City has taken that on, and they have a number of people who are working to ensure that this will be cared for the next however many years.
So this is a permanent installation.
So this is a permanent installation. Yes, the city owns the artworks. Anything else?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.